Chapter 38. Isaiah chapter 38. We should, I think, finish what we see as kind of the first, a major section of Isaiah. Right? So 38 and 39 will kind of be when we get there, I'll kind of talk about why this is a major section, and we'll see kind of a change in tone or content, I guess. Tone content. We'll talk about it when we get there. But we're finishing up. So where we're at historically, remember Isaiah is prophesying in the late 700 BCs. So 740 to about 700-ish. We don't know specific dates there, but it's that time frame, right? Hezekiah is right now in chapter 38 is king over Israel. And so Isaiah was a prophet in the king's court with multiple kings. And that's where we're at. Assyria is the major bad guy. We call him bad guy, right? The major world power of the time. And Assyria has already conquered the north, Israel, Samaria, all those different kind of interchangeable names. And they've sent them off into exile. And now they've come down and they've conquered everything in Judah except for Jerusalem. And where we ended, right, chapter 37, we've heard this story in 2 Kings before, but the king of Assyria had sent his major general, and they had camped outside of the city, and they were sieging the city. They hadn't brought their siege ramps up to the gates yet, but they were just going to hold out. As long as they had enough food and water, then those in the city were going to run out before them, right? And what they did is they sent envoys so that they're trying to get the people at the walls, the regular folks, surrender. So they're speaking to them in their language so they can hear and say, this isn't going to go well for you. You're going to suffer. You're still going to lose. So why not lose on your own terms? You don't have to suffer. Just come on out. Why does so many people have to die? That's kind of the message. It's not as kind, but it was a play of strength by the Assyrians. Well, then Isaiah sends a message to the king, Hezekiah, and he says, God sent me word that the king of Assyria is going to fall. He's going to deliver you from this problem. How are we going to get out of this? Because everyone knows we're going to lose unless God delivers. Well, the angel of the Lord comes and slaughters thousands, tens of thousands, 185,000 is what verse 36 says. Assyrians. And the rest go back to Assyria. And then we find out that Sennacherib, who's the king, is murdered by two of his sons. Well, the two sons, history tells us, and I guess scripture, but it doesn't tell us why. History tells us why. The two sons were plotting against the king, and then but nobody liked that they got found out, and so they got sent off into exile or executed, I'm not sure. But the youngest son of Sennacherib is now king of Assyria. And so that's his name's Asheradon. That's the last verse of chapter 37. That's where we're at, right? New king in Assyria, the world power. Hezekiah and all of Jerusalem has seen this miraculous deliverance from the world power at the time. And here we are, verse 1 of chapter 38. In those days, Hezekiah became ill and was at the point of death. Okay, so we've seen this. It's a huge. It's kind of this best of times, worst of times. Things are really bad, and then man, you got to think the people the king are like, when are we going to catch a break? When are we going to catch a break? And then you see God move in this miraculous way, and you got to be over the moon, even if things are still really hard. And then, Hezekiah, the king, is at the point of death. He's so sick. He's at the point of death. And the prophet Isaiah, son of Amos, went to him and said, this is what the Lord says. Put your house in order, because you are going to die. You will not recover. I want to stress, this is a pretty profound statement because prophets in Israel, or in Jerusalem, Judah, but also I think those who have the title of prophet, it's a common title, and others, they are paid by the king. The king pays their salary if they're taking one, right? Prophet is supposed to be a voice for God, but if anybody's going to pay them, like Isaiah, it's from the king's pocketbook. And prophets don't want, you can imagine, a prophet probably doesn't want to upset the king. Now, their job is to speak for God, but you don't want to upset the boss who's paying the bills, right? And certainly, if the boss is sick and dying, you're hoping there's a little bit of job security, you think, what's going to happen if the new king comes up? You can see the temptation for a lot of prophets to, the worst part of false prophesying, saying things are going to be great, everything's good for you. But even if it's not that, kind of trying to hedge bets and say, well, we just don't know. And you get this clear message from God, he's not going to recover. Well, how can I soften the blow? Now Isaiah comes right out and says, get your house in order. I'm just going to shoot you straight. This is what God said, right? Doesn't come across here as a judgment, but as a reality. And in some ways, that's the place that we find ourselves in our own world, in our own time, when suffering happens. And we see it is not because suffering doesn't necessarily happen because of God's judgment, right? It's not because you did something wrong. Sometimes we don't understand and God doesn't send an explanation. He just sends it's time to get your house in order. And that's where we get in verse 1. Okay, verse 2. Hezekiah turned his face to the wall and he prayed to the Lord, remember, Lord, how I have walked before you faithfully and with wholehearted devotion, and have done what is good in your eyes. And Hezekiah wept bitterly. So he calls out to God and he says, I've done my best. Remember that I've tried. We see that in 2 Kings. Hezekiah is remembered as doing pretty well. Never as much. We never see a king like David. When we read through 1 and 2 Kings, and when we start getting kind of this rapid succession of kings, which isn't necessarily rapid, but just we cover a lot of ground a lot of time. There's bad kings. We hear about bad kings. And then there's decent kings, and there's good kings. Hezekiah, but even in the good kings it says, but he wasn't David, right? So we get good kings, but never as good as David. And Hezekiah here is praying. He said, just remember me. And then he starts weeping. This is a way of mourning. Verse 4. Then the word of the Lord came to Isaiah. Go and tell Hezekiah, this is what the Lord, the God your father David says. I've heard your prayer and seen your tears. I will add 15 years to your life, and I'll deliver you in the city from the hand of the king of Assyria. I will defend the city. So Hezekiah, while he may not have prayed, heal me from this, his prayer was, remember me. It was if you would just, if you remember me, meaning, would you have mercy on me? If we could, it's not quite a heal me because Isaiah's told him. He's saying it won't happen. So in some ways, what can I say except, okay, well, remember me. I've done all that I can and trying to do that. And God intervenes. God in his own way can intervene in our lives. Doesn't mean he will do it all the time or that there's a specific formula. Hezekiah didn't necessarily ask for it, but was trying to have a heart that was aligned with God, right? And that in itself is not the formula of, okay, if you just align your heart just right, you'll live longer. Well, no, but that's the way that life ought to be lived, is to say, I want my heart to be aligned with God. And when I die with my heart aligned with God, I'll be at peace. And if I live longer, but my heart's aligned with God, then I'm at peace there too. What I wouldn't want is to live longer with my heart crooked, right? And I think that's, so I won't expound upon here is why God answered a prayer of the heart here. when it seems that when he said earlier, well, you're going to die. Get your house in order. And yet we see God, what it tells me, what I take from it, is that God moves. And God moves in our lives, and he responds to us. And in his majesty, because we're imperfect, and yet he still responds.
So God is still love.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. So we see him move here. Okay. Verse 7. This is the Lord's sign to you, that the Lord will do what he's promised. I will make the shadow cast by the sun go back the 10 steps it's gone down on the stairway of Ahaz. So the sunlight went back the 10 steps it had gone down. So I don't know this. I'm assuming from context clues that they didn't have clocks. They didn't have watches, at least, right? Back then, they didn't have mechanical watches that tick. But there were different ways of telling time, sundials and things like that. The fact that he references the stairway of Ahaz, I presume that this is some sort of sundial of sorts. Wherever the sun's at, we know it's 3 o'clock, it's 4 o'clock, right? Depending on the step. And so here it says it's going to move back 10 steps. And I don't know how much a step of, meant. Not necessarily an hour, but minutes, quarter hours, I don't know.
Mine calls it a sundial.
Does it?
Sundial of Ahaz. It'll turn 10 degrees back.
So, whatever it was, I can take the clock and I can reset my watch, daylight savings time, I can move it back. What I can't do is move a sundial back, right? Maybe if it's a small one in your garden, you might be able to try to maneuver it, but even then it doesn't quite work the right way, right? And then here, they're steps. These aren't things that you can just kind of maneuver. This is an act of God that no one can do by accident. No one can maneuver this except for God. And so this is a sign, and so we see the sun moves backwards a time. We see something else like this when the sun stands still, not quite the same thing, right? But God moving in the cosmos in ways that defy physics and science. It's miraculous, right? Okay. So he says this is going to be the sign, and then he does it. We see that the sign happens. And then we're in verse 9. A writing of Hezekiah, king of Judah, after his illness and recovery. So this is Hezekiah writing after he was on the doorstep of death, and then he recovered. I said in the prime of my life, must I go through the gates of death and be robbed of the rest of my years? I said, I will not see again the Lord himself in the land of the living. No longer will I look on my fellow man or be with those who now dwell in the world. Like a shepherd's tent, my house has been pulled down and taken from me. So a shepherd's tent, shepherds were nomads. They grazed their flocks, and so they would, put up a tent and then take it down, move with the flock, right? And so here he compares his life like a shepherd's tent. It's been pulled down easily. Like a weaver, I've rolled up my life, and he's cut me off from the loom. Day and night, you made an end of me. I waited patiently till dawn, but like a lion, he broke all my bones. Day and night, you made an end of me. I cried like a swift or thrush. I moaned like a mourning dove. My eyes grew weak as I looked to the heavens. I am being threatened. Lord, come to my aid. So this comes across, it's a psalm essentially, right? It's the king writing psalms. We see David in the Psalter writes many psalms. This comes across like that. It's expressing vulnerability, right? In a poetic form. I was weak and I was close to death, etc. Verse 15. But what can I say? He's spoken to me, and he himself has done this. I will walk humbly all my years because of this anguish of my soul. Lord, by such things people live, and by spirit, and my spirit finds life in them too. You restored me to health and let me live. Surely it was for my benefit that I suffered such anguish. In your love, you kept me from the pit of destruction. You have put all my sins behind your back. So what we find Hezekiah is thinking about his suffering. This wasn't presumably just some short-lived. He was suffering and in anguish, and I don't know how long it lasted, but he was certain of his death. And so here he's making meaning of that. He's saying, why did this happen to me? And what his response is one of humility, right? It is an appreciation for the gift that I have, that what I have even now is now a gift to be cherished. And so much so that verse 17, he says, surely it was for my benefit. Not to say, I don't think he's saying, oh, it was a good thing in my suffering, but to say, the way that now I see life, it is a good thing because I appreciate so much more, right? And I find myself thinking about evil in such a way, or hard things, or suffering. It is not a balm that I can get out to others, right, in suffering, nor would I try to say, hey, you know what, this is really a good thing, this suffering, right? That's dismissing hardship. But as I wrestle with my own, when grief or difficulties come, and it's not that those things are gone or that suffering is gone, right? But that as I make meaning of that, as I see Hezekiah making meaning of it, it's that God is a redeemer and can redeem even evil, even bad things, for good, right? It's very different than God causing evil things to happen. He's not the author of evil things, but he can take even bad, even evil, and redeem it. So I find Hezekiah talking of God as a redeemer here. Verse 18. For the grave cannot praise you, death cannot sing your praise. Those who go down to the pit cannot hope for your faithfulness. The living, they praise you, as I am doing today. Parents tell their children about your faithfulness. So this is coming from a place of, again, ancient Jews, the Old Testament. They didn't have a view of resurrection that we have, right? And so they are thinking about death as final. So when he says, people can't sing your praises from the grave, they're not thinking about how we think of death. We assume it, even in our grief, our loved ones are still somewhere else, right? And for those of us of faith, we say, well, they're with God, they're praising God, of course the dead can sing praises to God, right? That's not the mindset for this ancient people. They see death is final. Who can sing hymns? Who can sing psalms from the grave? Nobody, right? Verse 20. The Lord will save me, and we will sing with stringed instruments all the days of our lives in the temple of the Lord. Isaiah had said, prepare a poultice of figs and apply it to the boil, and he will recover. Hezekiah had asked, what will be the sign that I will go up to the temple of the Lord? Chapter 39 will be let's just go into it. We'll see. Verse 39, chapter 39, verse 1. At that time, Marduk Baladan, son of Baladan, king of Babylon, sent Hezekiah letters and a gift because he had heard of his illness and recovery. Hey, how nice. He sent him, we send flowers to the hospital, for someone who's got an extended stay. This is so nice, the king of Babylon. And again, Babylon at this time is not the major power. Babylon is closer to Assyria geographically than Judah. But they're under just as much of a threat of power struggle that Judah is in its own way. They're not the world power yet. So he received this gift and some envoys. Verse 2, Hezekiah received the envoys gladly and showed them what was in the storehouses, the silver, the gold, the spices, the fine olive oil, his entire armory, and everything found among his treasures. There was nothing in his palace or in all the kingdom that Hezekiah did not show them. That is maybe not the best idea, right?
That's the first mistake.
Yeah, so it's really nice for someone to send some envoys and to send a nice gift basket, but that doesn't mean that they need to go through and show them all the state secrets, right? That's foolish. Verse 3, then Isaiah the prophet went to King Hezekiah and asked, what did those men say? Where'd they come from? Isaiah probably sounds like he's got an air of already knowing what's going on. Oh, from a distant land, Hezekiah replied. They came to me from Babylon. The prophet asked, what did they see in your palace? Oh, they saw everything in my palace, Hezekiah said. There is nothing among my treasures I did not show them. Then Isaiah said to Hezekiah, hear the word of the Lord Almighty. The time will surely come when everything in your palace and all that your predecessors have stored up until this day will be carried off to Babylon. Nothing will be left, says the Lord. So Isaiah uses this opportunity to speak some of God's words that everything's going to be carried away. Now, was Hezekiah foolish? Yeah, I mean, that seems obvious. But the carried off and the Babylon's going to do this is not necessarily all punishment because of Hezekiah's actions. Hezekiah's acting foolishly, but we've seen already that God is going to punish his people and send them into exile. That has not happened yet. Lots of the people have been sent into exile, but Jerusalem stood strong. They haven't fallen yet, but they are going to be sent into exile. And so we see some of this as, you are really foolish. That was a really dumb thing to do. But it is also being used as a way, this is the method, the mode in which the judgment is coming about, right? So if we're going to hold all of Isaiah in context, Babylon is coming, and they're going to be God's form of judgment on the people. Verse 7. Okay, so he says, nothing will be left. Verse 7. And some of your descendants, your own flesh and blood, who will be born to you, will be taken away, and they will become eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. Now, eunuchs, which means they're castrated or they can't reproduce, right? That doesn't mean they're slaves, but it is a source of control in that if you've got a conquering kingdom, like let's say the king of Babylon, I want your leaders, the way that Babylon worked, is they wanted the leaders to be well educated in Babylonian culture, right? They wanted them to be able to speak well because they wanted them to lead. But I don't want any questions about succession. And so, if Hezekiah's sons are eunuchs in the house of Babylon, that means they're treated well. They're fed well. They're educated well. They're probably going to be leaders of the people, but they won't have any descendants to question the king of Babylon, right? And so after that generation, the Babylonians will find other people to lead as kind of governors of their provinces. But that's kind of the idea here, is that that was often a practice. So the eunuchs weren't necessarily slaves in the way that we think about slaves. They were subservient. Do what?
Like Daniel and the three.
That's right. Yeah, they would have been in positions like Daniel. Now, it never tells us in Daniel if they were eunuchs or not, if they were made eunuchs, but it also never talks about their descendants. We just don't know, but that's the position they were in. Daniel, and that's why when we read Daniel, we read they're fed the finest foods, But Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego are holding to their laws and their tradition of their God and worshiping God without trying to bring undue attention to themselves, and yet still holding tightly. And that in itself encompasses what we understand why the Jews survived the exile, why the tradition of the Jews was able to return, because the Samaritans didn't. They didn't hold to the faith traditions. And even though the Jews, we see it over and over, even in exile, we'll see it in chapter 40, where the criticisms from, they still strayed, but there was a pillar of stability that they held to this tradition. They knew who they were and their identity. And so, because of that, they were able to survive for decades and decades and then return, right? And then survive even longer, even into when the Greeks took over, the Persians, Greeks, Romans, etc.
David or the three others.
Do what?
Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
That's right.
They
Daniel
never
and
returned, right?
Well, we don't hear about them returning. I imagine we probably would have. I don't think it's a stretch to say they did not return, but they were in positions of authority in Babylon and then in the Persian king's court as well. So
There's nothing in any of the history that says anything about them.
not that I know of. Of course, they weren't kings either, right? And so it doesn't necessarily mean that everybody who was in their positions were eunuchs either, right? But it does make sense that a king, you don't want a king's kids to keep having kids because they can claim then that I'm going to be king, right? And so it doesn't necessarily mean that they were all eunuchs, but it's a reality of the way that Babylon governed.
Was it only Babylon? Or what?
Oh,
Other kingdoms probably. It sounds like it's a cultural part of during that time maybe conquering empires did that.
Yeah, I assume it wasn't. Yeah, I assume it wasn't only Babylon. They probably weren't the first ones to come up with it. Maybe they are well known for it, but I wouldn't be surprised if we saw in histories Assyria and others doing things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah. Okay. Verse 7 says they'll become eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. Verse 8, the word of the Lord you have spoken is good, Hezekiah replied, for he thought there will be peace and security in my lifetime. So Isaiah gives this prophecy that the king of Babylon is going to come, and I don't know how to take that Hezekiah outside of, well, I guess he's glad it's not happening to him, which is really, it comes across as poor leadership to not be concerned with future generations, right? And that's, at least in Isaiah, the last we hear about Hezekiah. And we certainly, so this story we hear in 2 Kings as well. I don't recall exactly if it ended the same way in which Hezekiah, it ended with kind of that tone. But it's not depicted as a good thing either. Him bringing in the envoys and showing them around and whatnot.
Yeah.
And what we do see in 2 Kings, that kind of eventuality that the king of Babylon comes and takes all the things, not just from the palace, but from the temple, right? These things that are sacred that Solomon has put together and made sure that it's all there and it's all appropriate and it's kind of the wealth of the nation and sacred. And the king of Babylon has a ledger, right? That, okay, let's make sure we go get this thing, get that. It's not good. It's
Do you
not
think
good.
Hezekiah did that out of pride?
Yeah, maybe. I'm trying to think, it kind of feels like that, right? The kind of an episode of Cribs, but an ancient. Do y'all ever, you know what I'm talking about? MTV, where they go to a celebrity's house and they show them all, the basketball court and the garage and their fridge, and look at all the waters, the expensive water that I have in my fridge and things like that.
You like Nancy Pelosi's freezer?
But it kind of feels like that, is to let me show off all the stuff. That's got to be what is going through his mind, I think.
He's a king. Show
Yeah.
off with stuff.
Yeah, and
God uses that pride.
right, and not seeing Babylon as a threat, because Assyria is the threat, instead of trying to be wise and say, well, even if we're allies, let's be careful.
So the ones that went into captivity were all of either the tribe of Benjamin and Judah, is that right?
Well, yes. Well, I don't know that it was 100%. What we know is that it was, we see them as Judah, the nation, which would have been the south. And so if there was any who were from, biologically from other tribes, but living in the south, they would have potentially still aligned with Jerusalem. Because I know we hear about those in other tribes later on. And so my only thinking is that it must be, in the way that we talk about Judah, we're now talking about the nation more than we are about the tribe. Even though, it's the tribe, but at this point we're so far removed that it's the nation of Judah, and it kind of becomes the nation of Israel as we think about it now. Even though we're not talking about all 12 tribes, we're talking about those who are Jews. The reason they're synonymous with Jews means from Judah. Anyway, at a certain point, it kind of takes on its own meaning of I would say, those who are loyal to the temple, those who are loyal to Jerusalem, right? Because the north weren't. And so the 10 tribes who had gone north were not. But like anything, I think there had to have been some who stayed and were loyal to the...
There has to be some of those out of the northern tribe, though, that are still Jews.
Sure.
All the way, because of the 144,000.
Right.
Well,
and so that's the reason we don't hear anything more about the north is not because there was a Holocaust of the north, right? The reason we don't have any sort of history or something is because they go off, and when they return, there seems to not be some sort of unified focus. And so what we see, I think we can hold on to, because we see throughout Scripture, is that there are times when there are people who are faithful to Yahweh, even over and against those all around them. And so it stands to reason that there are some who got exiled and might return and might still be faithful, but we just don't have record of them, right? I don't think that's a stretch to say in the least, right? But for the most part, there's not a unified authority or leadership that kind of is able to hold to this. And, for the Jews, it's not necessarily that there's unified leadership in necessarily a king figure, right? It's a little bit of that, and it's a little bit of the priest, and it's a little bit of the prophet. We see that come with Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra wasn't a king, right, but operated as sort of a religious figure. And something, though, was holding these people together. And they were kind of holding each other together throughout the exile.
So it'd be kind of hard to track anyway if they're scattered, which is
Yeah.
what they were. They
Right.
were scattered throughout the...
That's exactly right. They didn't all go to one city.
Right, so it would be very hard to have any kind of record
Yeah.
of any of what was going on, but they still existed.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And so what do you call that then? Like how do you know? And it's kind of well, are you still faithful? Right? Do you still hold to the tenets of our faith, and do you still worship Yahweh and whatnot, right? And so you even see that when we get to the New Testament Roman kind of period, they call it the diaspora, which is like the spreading, the Greek word for like spreading, and it's Jews that are not just in the Promised Land, but are in cities in Greece or Rome, but they're not. But they're still Jews. They're still thought of as Jews, and they still see themselves as Jews, and they hold to the tenets of Judaism, right? Saul before Paul, was presumably one of these. Like, he's from school in Tarsus, right? So, someone who wasn't necessarily in the Holy Land, but around. So it's kind of been a tenet of Judaism that has endured, right?
He calls himself the Hebrew of Hebrews, you know.
Yeah.
He was half Greek, wasn't he, and half Jewish?
I don't
Who's
know.
that?
Saul.
Yeah. Yeah, but which, is interesting that he, refers to himself in such a way. But it's because he knew the law, and he did everything, every little bit that he could, so much so that he even persecuted people who read the law wrong. Y'all, don't know what you're doing, and you're a plague to Jews, and so let's get rid of it, right? Okay. We won't start chapter 40, but let me talk a little bit about this section. We'll kind of go over this next week again, too. So there seems to be a